Hey Patreon viewers, so a couple of things today that are annoying me about certain groups of, and in some cases individuals, sabre fencers online in particular. And these are people who do HEMA, who do historic fencing, sometimes classical fencing or both, and very often they also do modern Olympic sport fencing. I'll refer to it for purposes of this video. Now, what are the two things that are annoying me? So there are two things. First of all, it is people who complain about those of us who use heavy sabres, okay, and I'll qualify that in a moment. And the other thing is the way that certain people, if I just swap over to a modern Olympic sabre, well, it's a kind of retro one, but nevertheless it's a relatively modern, probably 1960s or 70s, the way that certain people from a sports sabre fencing background fence, okay, rather cut, hit. Okay, now, something I want to mention off the bat, this isn't me having a go at modern sport fencing. In fact, you know, I did modern sabre for years. Certainly the whole time I was at university I did sabre. Before that I did foil. After that I did épée. So I've done all three modern Olympic weapons, and I think that modern fencing's great, teaches you lots of things. There are certainly things it doesn't teach you, but it teaches you lots of things. They have a great sort of setup for teaching kids. They have very efficient beginner lessons. Usually the clubs have been running for years, so they're very efficient. They've got sort of senior teachers and sub-teachers, and they're very well organised. And there's great pedagogy. I always have problems with that, pedagogy, way of teaching. You know, a way of essentially, they've got a very efficient and structured and well-established way of teaching. Now, when people come to me and they're under the age of 16, they say, I really want to get into HEMA. Unfortunately, we can't take under 16-year-olds in my club for the most part. We only take over 18-year-olds, but we can take 16-year-olds with parental permission. And that's an insurance issue mostly. Well, it is an insurance issue, but additionally as well, I have taught younger kids in the past, and really they need to be in a separate class from the adults for various reasons. The way that you manage them is different, and depending on the kids, of course, but generally speaking. So I always advise them, go and do a year or two of modern fencing, because it will never be wasted experience. It certainly wasn't for me. Yeah, okay, I did modern fencing, and then I went into basket hilt to backsword, and then I went into longsword and sword and buckler and a few other things. And I came back to sabre years later. Now, military sabre is very different from modern Olympic sabre, or quite different, but it has a lot of the same fundamentals. So all of that experience I'd gained both watching how people teach beginners, foil and sabre, mostly foil, I have to say, because when I was a beginner, that's what I learnt from a very good instructor. That went through to how I teach and the way that I teach certain things. Also, my belief that yes, foil is, as many of the Victorian treatises say, is a very good basis for good sabre fencing later on. Now, so I'm not having a go at sport fencing. I'm a big fan of it. It's not personally for me. It's not what I want to do now, but there are some people, in fact I would say a growing number of people, who do both historical fencing or HEMA, and they do modern fencing as well. And some of the things creeping over from modern fencing into historical fencing are brilliant. Some of the ways of training, some of the fitness stuff, some of the just mentality, sporting mentality, sports psychology, all kinds of stuff like that. That's great, but there's also some negative things. You rarely just get positive things, okay? Now, a couple of those negative things are the things which are annoying me now. So, the reason that we use an 800 and something gram sabre is because that's literally what the sources that we work with in my club, primarily Hutton and Waite, that's what they tell us to do. That's what British military sabre sources, for the most part, tell you to do. Hutton explicitly says you should use a weapon that is the same weight as the real weapon you're going to use in war. And a lot of HEMA people totally agree with that and are totally on board with that, okay? But there's a couple of complicated factors. Number one, the Italians didn't agree with that, not after Rodelli anyway. The Italians, and it has to be said the French and a few others, did use lighter weight fencing sabres for training purposes. Now, the principal reason given in the Italian sources is that it enables you to train for longer. Okay, but there are additional reasons as well. You don't need to wear such heavy protective equipment. The fencing's a bit quicker and perhaps arguably a bit more nimble, athletic, whatever. So there's a kind of aesthetic or even artistic preference for a quicker moving, lighter weapon that you can do more things with more quickly and use a little bit more similarly to a foil, which is harder to do when the weapon handles like a real military sabre. Okay, so both are historically correct. I'm not saying that one's wrong, one's right. The fact is that historically people disagreed on this. Certainly the British sources that I study preferred to use a practice, and it's based on the 1864 pattern gymnasium sword, which is exactly the same weight and balance as this, basically, as this Eastern sabre by Covetton, which I developed with them. So a lot of the British use these, a lot of the Italians use these. Now, there are couple of other points to make. One is that a lot of these Italian sabres that are supposedly lighter aren't actually lighter, and some of them are just as heavy as the British ones. Okay, now where the misconception and misunderstanding comes from is the Italian ones tend to balance far closer to the hilt. So you look at this as a Masiello style sabre, and you'll notice how close that balances to the hilt. Really, really close. It's slightly lighter than the other one, but not very much. And in fact, on Eastern Antique Arms website, if you look on the research page, I've got articles on there and I put a load of weights of original antique examples. I've got a big box of them right behind the camera over there. And I put the weights up. And in fact, some of the Italian sabres weighed just as heavy. In fact, one of them was even heavier than the typical British ones. Okay, so they do actually weigh the same as a real sword. But you'll notice the point of balance on the British one and on this Covetton is balanced where a real military sabre would be. So sometimes light and heavy doesn't literally mean in mass light and heavy. Sometimes it means that because this one balances further from the hand, it feels heavier and it feels a little bit slower and a bit more cumbersome, but it is more like a real sword. Whereas this one, which is only slightly lighter than that, is much, much quicker because it balances close to the hand. How does that compare to a modern Olympic sabre? Well, the modern Olympic sabre is way lighter. So these are normally about 400 to 500 grams. The Italian practice sabres are normally 600 to 800 grams, and the British ones are normally about 800 grams, sometimes as heavy as 900 grams. The Swedish ones, incidentally, can be over 1,000 grams. So there were countries, particularly Sweden, using even heavier practice weapons than the British used. Now the modern sports sabre, although it's only like 450 grams, balances right near the hilt as well. So this is just a crazy thing. You can move this in a way that you absolutely cannot move certainly any conventional sabres. I'm not going to say any military sword. There might be some spadroon or something which handles a bit like this modern sports sabre, but really it handles very, very differently to a sabre. So my first annoyance, let's deal with that, let's wrap that bit up, is people going, oh, you're using really heavy sabres, you should use lighter sabres because they don't hurt so much, they don't have to wear so much protective gear, you get faster fencing, blah, blah, blah. Well, look, different swords for different systems. My system tells me to use a heavier one or real weight one. I use that. I don't have any problem whatsoever with other people using Masiello or Rodelli or Parise or whatever style lighter or balanced closer to the hand sabres. In fact, we're considering doing it for certain training within our own club to accentuate certain skills. Indeed, I don't have any problem with someone using a modern sports sabre. Okay, there are definitely things you could gain out of using one of these. You could wear much lighter equipment, of course. And speed, speed and reaction time and stuff. There's stuff you can learn with this that it's much harder to do with a heavy sabre. I don't have anything against those things, but just don't criticise the people using heavier sabres when we're doing exactly what they did at the time and what the manuals that we study from tell us to do. Okay, and the other thing I would say is if you're so obsessed with using a light sabre, then do modern sport fencing. Why complain about what HEMA does when HEMA's using HEMA sources? Just do modern Olympic sabre. It's out there, it exists already. You don't have to reinvent it. Right. The second thing is how people cut. So this is very related to that first point. So the simple fact is that when you've got a weapon that weighs 800 grams or even heavier in the case of the Swedish ones and balances that far from the hand, surprise, surprise, it weighs the same as the real military sabre. It balances the same as the military sabre. So when you move it, it moves exactly like the real military sabre. When you get a weapon which weighs similar but balances closer to the hand, the tip moves much, much quicker. Okay, it impacts with usually less force. You're not going to require as much protective equipment, but it's a much quicker weapon and more nimble. Now, there are some real military swords that are balanced quite close to the hand and do move more quickly. Okay, that's absolutely fine, but it changes the way you move, it changes the way you do things. Now, in both of these systems, if we're talking about, let's call it Anglo-French, then the moulinet, or the cut, comes from the wrist with a circular motion, and you do that circular motion to get momentum into the blade to cut effectively, so you're hitting hard enough to cut. With the Italian, certainly post Radelli, the preference was to rotate from the elbow. So despite the fact that it's a lighter and quicker sword, they're actually giving cuts from the elbow, which means that you can use a light sword but still get a lot of power into it because you're rotating from the elbow. Now clearly you've got three main points of rotation: shoulder, elbow, wrist, and you could add in the flexation of the hand and the fingers as well into that. Now, modern sport saber, this is the problem, and this is my bugbear. A lot of people are bringing all of that good baggage from modern Olympic saber into historical HEMA saber or historical fencing. A lot of the good things, but one of the bad things that's being brought is the method of cutting. So the simple fact is that in modern saber, all you have to do to win a point is touch the other person. Okay, a tap, boom, that's it. That's a cut. So it's completely different to a British or French or Hungarian that rotates from and cuts from the wrist with a moulinet and powers the blow, or an Italian who rotates from the elbow and gives a decent blow. A modern sport saber doesn't give a blow, it gives a touch, okay, because you're trying to complete an electric circuit. It's purely a touch. Now, in the old days, before electric equipment came in, you had to give a cut with the front edge, and you had to give had to be a cut, and the judges would sometimes call no point if it wasn't a proper cut. Unfortunately, when they brought electric equipment in, there's no way to differentiate between the side, the edge and the flat, at least not with the current equipment. And so literally you can do that and hit someone with the flat on their mask or on their arm, and you score an electrical point because it makes a circuit between their uniform, my sword, and the light box that I'm connected to. So all you're trying to do is, as quickly as possible, obviously you're guarding and fencing and moving backwards and forwards, as quickly as possible you're just aiming to touch the other person, which means they're not cutting. Now, that's not a problem for modern Olympic sport, because the modern Olympic sport is what it is. The rules are the rules. Fencing's now quite abstract from what it used to be. That's fine, I don't care. The problem is when that mentality and that way of cutting is brought into historical fencing, and we need to judge and rule against it. Because if something's not a proper cut, it's not a proper cut. It shouldn't score, we shouldn't recognise it. If we're rewarding people for simply doing a touch in a modern sporting fashion with no moulinet, no rotation from the elbow or the wrist, just a simple extension and a tap, then we're not doing historical fencing anymore. That's not in the sources we study. We very specifically have moulinets, either from the wrist or the elbow usually, for a reason, because we're trying to cut with a real sword, and that's what fencing used to be training for. If we're only training to make a touch, to make an electrical contact, you're not fencing anymore, in my view. Well, it's a form of fencing, it's a form of modern fencing, but it's not historical fencing. So there you go, there's my two bugbears. I don't have anything against sport fencing, and it has a huge amount to teach us, and it has taught me a huge amount, and does play a very active part in the way that I teach and the way that I fence and everything else. But you have to pay attention to the sources, whether they say to use a full weight sword or say to, follow what their advice is and cut in the way that they say to cut, because they were teaching how to use a sword as a martial art. I hope this has been thought-provoking. Please post your comments underneath. Great to see you guys, and I will see you again before the end of the month, of course, back on Patreon and on the public channel. Cheers, folks.